Hi and welcome back. In this video I'm going to be making a replacement wheel for an antique bracket clock. The wheel that's currently fitted to the clock is a replacement already, as I'll explain in the video. So this video is going to cover all the processes involved, start to finish, from making a replacement wheel in a sort of antique style. So I hope you enjoy. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks very much. Okay, so here we've got the top end of the chime train of this clock, which has got a replacement wheel, previously replaced wheel in it. And that wheel, you can see quite clearly, doesn't really match very well. I mean, they've made an attempt at the crossings, but it's not really in keeping. Three glaringly obvious things are: one, the sort of soldered up mess of the collet here. Two is the shape of the teeth, which are a very modern curved root tooth form. And three is the collet, which is completely the wrong shape. I don't know where they've arrived at that shape from, because it's not seen anywhere else in the clock, but that's what it's got. So anyway, the client did want this wheel to be replaced with one that's more in keeping, even though it does actually work, but even so, it's part of the integrity of the clock, if you like, to have a wheel that looks a lot better than this one. As it's already been replaced, we don't have to worry about the originality of the part, because it's not like we're condemning an original part. It is actually a replacement already. So what I'm going to do in this video is run through the process of making a replacement wheel. I'm going to be making it using cast brass, as the original wheels are, so hopefully it will match in quite nicely when we've finished. This is the pinion that the wheel is going to mesh with. It's a 6-leaf pinion, and if we get a Thornton's cutter, you can see here, these are off-the-shelf cutters that are commercially available, horological cutters. We can present one of those cutters to the teeth and it fits very nicely. So that cutter is a 0.5 module for a 6-tooth pinion. So we'll put that to one side and go and have a look at how the maths actually works out, and that will give us an idea as to which cutter we're going to use. I'm just going to measure the centre distances of the existing holes, because obviously we want to use the original holes in the clock. There's no question that we would move the holes. So I've already set this up, measuring the centre distance, and that centre distance computes to 24.6. So we'll add that to our equations. Okay, so we can measure the OD of the pinion, which comes out at about 4.6. 4.6 for the OD. We know it's 6 leaves. Now we think it might be a 0.5 module, but we'll work out what it should be. I got fed up with doing the maths every single time for pinions. We only use a small variety of different numbers of leaves in horology, and there's a spread of cutters, module sizes. So I just worked them all out in a little spreadsheet here, so I've got this cheat sheet. So if we have a look, we I'm pretty sure that it's being cut with something that's somewhere near the cutter size of a module 0.5, which for a 6-leaf pinion theoretically works out at 3.86. So the pinion is cut quite a long way over size, isn't conforming to theory. It's actually cut closer to a 0.6 module. If we get a 0.6 cutter, it will present to it, but it's way too big. Pinion leaves are much fatter than a 0.6 would give in the cut. So pinion's not conforming to theory. However, that doesn't mean that we can't make the wheel work. So back to the wheel. Have a look at the OD of the existing wheel, which was working, remember, so we shouldn't disregard this just because it doesn't look very nice. So we're getting the OD out at about 47.09. So next thing we need is the number of teeth. "72". Now the wheel itself is miles away from any kind of theory because it's cut with a round bottom cutter of a strange type. So if we just have a look at a Thornton's cutter, that's a 0.6, which won't go in because of the round bottom form, but is actually not far off filling the tooth. A 0.55 is getting really loose in there, so we know that a 0.5 is going to be way off. So I'm suspecting that 0.6 is probably what we want on this wheel, but let's carry on and see where we get to with the theory. Right, so the theory is module equals OD, which we have, over number of teeth, which we have, plus 2.76, which is the factor for a wheel. So that equals 47.09 over 74.76. 72 plus 2.76, 74.76 equals 0.629. 0.629. So the closest module there is a 0.6. So I was guessing that a 0.6 for the wheel was probably going to be something like. However, the fact that the pinion has been cut essentially oversize or correctly sized for a 0.6, but then a smaller module has been used, or it wouldn't have been a module, it would have been a fly cutter, but a smaller size than theoretically correct has been used. That means that we could really do with some smaller teeth for it to mesh nicely. So we want to use a bigger module. So I'm going to suggest actually that I cut the wheel stepped up to a 0.65, cutting it with a slightly bigger cutter. That will give us slightly smaller teeth, which should mesh quite nicely with that pinion. This is the old wheel mounted with the original pinion in the depthing tool. I've set the centre distance of the depthing tool to the clock plates, so it's actually demonstrating pretty much what is happening inside the clock. And it runs. I mean, the clock was working like this, so the wheel does work, but I was just checking it just to see where we're at in terms of engagement, so that I can decide upon the OD that I want to make the new wheel, because this wheel again is not conforming to theory if you do the maths. And looking at the engagement, I don't think I could really get away with it being any deeper than that, and I think the mesh is going to improve by having thinner teeth anyway. So I'm going to make it to basically the same OD as this, but I'm going to cut it with a different module cutter. Just one last thing about arriving at the size of the cutter that we're going to use. we measured the centre distance at 24.65. What we can do is we can just have a look and see what the theory works out at between that wheel and pinion. We've already established that the pinion is not conforming to theory, so it's not going to be exact. But in order to do that for the centre distance, to work out theoretical centre distance, we'd put the number of teeth of the wheel added to the number of teeth of the pinion, or leaves of the pinion, divide that by 2, and then we would times that by the module. So if I times that by 0.65, that comes out at 25.35. So it gives us a theoretical centre distance slightly bigger than what we've got in reality, but we can, I think it's in the right ballpark. If we have a look at 0.6 is 23.4, so that's under. So 0.65 is slightly over, 0.6 is slightly under. That makes sense that we're in the kind of ballpark for a non-theoretically conforming wheel and pinion at around the 0.65 module range. So now that we've established what cutter we're going to use, the next thing to do, we know the OD of the wheel, is just to work out what thickness we're going to use in terms of material. This one's measuring up at just under 2 millimeters. However, it is quite chunky. It is on the quarter train though, so maybe that's okay. But the pinwheel of the strike side, which is the equivalent wheel in the train, is 1.25, so I think just a little bit thinner than that. If we have a look at the wheel that drives the chime barrel, which is another wheel which this has to mesh with, that's measuring up at 1.78. So yeah, okay, 1.8 might be a 1.8 might be a suitable replacement. Now that I've pulled that wheel out, let's just have a look and see what the tooth form of that looks like, because these two have to mesh. So the wheel of the chime barrel, if we present a cutter to it, this is the cutter that I was proposing using, which is 0.65 module. It's slightly sloppy, but it's not too bad. Let's just zoom in on that. Okay, so there's a better shot for you to see. It's not far off, and I'm sure it will certainly mesh okay, but it's slightly sloppy. It will give a slightly fatter tooth than that one. Now if we get the next module up again, which is a 0.7, that one even goes in, and that one fits quite snugly. But the wider the module, the bigger the size, the longer the cut, and the longer the tooth will be every time. And as you can see, this cutter, even though the width is right, is really too long. It's barely putting a curve. These aren't full form teeth. If you notice, they haven't really got the sort of point of the bishop's hat, because this is an old clock. However, the 0.65 will give the start of the curve, especially if I just cut it slightly deeper than these, so it will be slightly longer teeth than these, and will give the start of the curve, and then I can just tidy up the tops of the teeth with a file if I need to. But we'll see. I think we'll see how a 0.65 goes. We can always put a 0.7 through it later if we need to, but that's what I'm going to start off with. Right, so material. This is cast brass sheet. As you can see, it's just raw casting. It's something different to how you would buy brass these days, as a rolled brass, or however they produce what I would call modern brass. This is what I would call yellow clockmaker's brass, and this is quite a similar material to what would have been used by the original maker. The thing about cast brass is it needs to be work hardened to an extent. If I was to just make the wheel out of this, it would be fine and it would work fine, but it wouldn't be as strong as it perhaps could be. So what I'm going to do, this is not the thickest piece of brass that I would like to start with actually, but yeah, we've got just under 2.5 mil there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a bit out of this, and then I'm going to hammer it and work hard on it and reduce it down to perhaps, well, we'll see where we get to, but perhaps about 2mm, something like that. Give me just enough room to face it off and get it down to perhaps about 1.7, something like that, as our finished thickness of the wheel after it's been faced off. Well, this is the old table off my pantograph, which, as you can see, has had a really hard life. It had the extended table, and I use it with the small table because that's all I need for my needs. And as this has already been abused, I don't mind abusing it a bit more. So don't chastise me for using it as an anvil. You can see a dish starting up already as the metal starts to move around. So I can feel that already we're starting to get, it's starting to get harder. You can actually hear it. So let's just see where we're at. So about 2.4, so we haven't actually lost too much from it yet, which also means we haven't compressed it too much yet, so might give it a bit more abuse and see if we can make it a little bit thinner. .3 now, so we are making it a bit thinner. What I've done is just roughly mark the where the teeth are going to be, to make sure that I can ensure that we've got a relatively hard bit of material where the teeth are. Definitely sounding hard now. So I've got it relatively flat. I've got it compressed. I think work hardened enough for this wheel, and I'm now just going to give it a bit of the old layout fluid, a bit of the old blue dicum, and the next stage will be to just mark out the blank. So let's wait for that to dry. So the OD of the wheel is going to be 47.1, and I'm going to make the blank to 48. Set the dividers to 24 and go over and mark the wheel. Okay, so I've machined the blank, and I machined it in the other Shorblin 102 and moved it over to this machine because this one is set up with the gear cutting equipment. The concentricity between the two machines is usually very good, but I think this particular holder is not as quite as accurate as it could be. So it means when changing it between machines, it's actually the position of the holder in the collet rather than the difference in concentricity between the machines. So I've had a little bit of a play just trying different positions of the holder in the collet, and I've got it down to reasonably accurate. I mean, it's only just over 0.01, which for this type of wheel is going to be perfectly sufficiently concentric. If I do find that I need to make it even more concentric, I can always bore it out in the 6 jaw after the wheel is cut. But I think this is perfectly sufficient. If I want to make a really concentric wheel, then I would not swap the machines. I would do all the work in the same machine. So I would turn the blank, it held in the collet that it's going to be cut in without moving it, and then you're going to be guaranteed absolute concentricity. But for this one, I'm happy with how it is, and we'll proceed to cutting the teeth. So, as was always a possibility, the teeth cut with the 0.65 module cutter are a little bit fat. You'll notice that I've left a land, I haven't gone to a point. That's for another reason. I want to have a slightly rounded top to the tooth to match in with the rest of the clock. But the teeth are slightly fat. It does work, but I'd like a slightly better mesh with that pinion with fat teeth, fat leaves. If you look at the wheel that it engages with, which gives you an idea of what the original wheel would perhaps have been like, those teeth are slightly thinner. So what I'm going to do next is to use the 0.7 cutter, which is the next size up, and I'm going to just pass the 0.7 cutter through. As you can see, it won't go in, it'll take a cut. So that'll make all the teeth slightly thinner, and I may just cut very slightly deeper as well, just to put a little bit more of a radius on the top. And then the final radius I'm going to touch in with a file so that it's not coming up to a complete point. And that should give us a wheel which is more or less a replacement for the original. Okay, so I've recut the wheel with the 0.7 module cutter, which has given a thinner tooth, which is what we wanted. And it is engaging reasonably well, but what I'm going to do now, because I've got this set to the centre distance of the plates, and it is a bit deep for my liking, and I've also had to cut to give almost the full tooth form. So what I'm going to do now is to just top the wheel in the lathe, and then I'm just going to file the rounded top form of the tooth in by hand, and that should give us our final tooth form, and then we can proceed to crossing out the wheel. Might just be able to make out that at the root of each of the teeth on this original wheel there's a little nick, and there's also a ring that runs around both sides of the wheel. So we're going to just introduce those little file nicks, and we're also going to put the ring in to make our wheel look as the original one does. We're homing in on completion of the wheel now. We've got it cut, we've got it crossed out, we've got it basically finished off, and the next job is to actually mount it onto the arbor. So if you look at this original wheel, you can see that the shape of the collet is reasonably specific. Okay, so the next stage will be to soft solder that in place. Now we've established that the wheel is in the right orientation between the plates, it's time to fix it onto that arbor. And to do that we'll use what's known as a spin riveter. Now, a spin riveter is basically a piece of hardened steel with a hole in it and then a domed area, and the domed section is basically going to fold over the material. It's sort of muddling the material over, which is doing the same thing as riveting, but instead of hitting it with it, you're applying a pressure whilst the material is turning, and it's doing the same thing. So that's just going to spread the material into the wheel. But before we do that, I'm just going to put a slight bevel on the inside, or on the wheel here. I'm just going to cut a slight bevel and put some little nicks, file nicks, for the material to spread into to stop the wheel from turning. It doesn't need to be much, because I always add a little bit of Loctite, green Loctite as well, which is the modern way of doing it, which, to be perfectly honest, the green Loctite alone is enough to hold it all together. So you can see I've just put a very slight chamfer there, and you might just be able to make out I've put a few little file nicks within the chamfer, just on the edge of the hole, and that will give the spreading material somewhere to go that will bind it all up solid. And that's it. That's all there is to it. That's spin riveting. So a little bit of graver work was the final step. That enabled me to shape the collet to match the rest of the clock. There you can see an original collet, and then if we zoom in, there's the replacement collet. So much more in keeping with the rest of the clock. So there we have it between the plates. And it's engaging, really meshes really beautifully. It meshes a lot better between the plates than it did actually in the depthing tool. But I'm really happy with that as a finished finished job. It matches in with the rest of the train really nicely, and I think is a much more in keeping wheel to replace that previous replaced part. Okay, so here we have the finished part. I'm really happy with the result. We've got the correct looking teeth, we've got the correct looking wheel, we've got the correct looking collet. It's all mounted nice and true and runs beautifully in the clock. So I'm really happy that that is a really nice replacement part. I'm happy with the finish. There's a little bit of final finishing work to carry out, which I'll do as I clean the rest of the clock. But for now, I hope you'll agree that that is a much better replacement wheel. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was a bit of a long video, but I think we covered quite a lot of ground. So if you're interested in the individual processes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to link the points in the video below in the description, so you can click on those individually. So spin riveting, cutting the teeth, the maths, and you can click on them individually. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please tell all your friends, like the video, share it far and wide. Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already subscribed to the channel. I'm homing in on the magic 1,000 subscribers mark, and I'm really hoping to get to that point in the very near future. And you can help by clicking the subscribe there and clicking the bell icon. I'd really appreciate it. I'll see you on the next video. Thank you.